Stuart, Sim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The 100th episode, man. I'm so honored that you guys joined me, man. Like I'm so excited for this. The first time we've had two guests simultaneously, so we're going to see how this goes. I know that Stuart, like my viewers will have seen you like a bunch of times. This is your fourth time on the show, so I'm going to kick it off with Sim. Sim, do you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody what you do, what you're about?
Yeah. Cool. So my name is Sim, born and raised in Belgium. I left Belgium when I was 24. I moved to Norway to work as a personal trainer because that wasn't really a thing here back in the day. Um, I mean, health and fitness in Belgium isn't really that big. It's starting to become bigger now. But so for me, the only way to be involved in the field was actually to move from Belgium. The options weren't that many. I had met a girl from Norway. I went there. I was like, okay, this place is, very different from Belgium. So I shot my shot and landed a job there as a personal trainer, and then started developing the well, I wouldn't really say like the business necessarily, but the service, putting more and more things together. And I kind of like really wanted to figure out what was going on with people beyond the standard level, so to call it, right? I mean, there's obviously layers to everything. And I kept going layer after layer, and then I kind of figured out like, okay, I need to learn a lot more, and that's always a process. You keep learning anyway, but then I obviously need to stop doing that and start doing something else so I can bring in and integrate many more of these dimensions and tools. So that kind of lands us in where we are today, which is I use a lot of the neuropsychology. So everything that I learned about neurology, biology, cognitive science, and psychology and philosophy, and integrated that into a service, which means that like clients fly me to a location, I stay with them for a month at a time, and like all my cognitive machinery is basically at their disposal, and we just differentiate everything in terms of behavior, their psychology, neurotransmitters, you name it. Like we touch all of these aspects, and then I try to work from the top down and the bottom up so that they're supported, their biology and their neurology, with whatever tool we need, and then do all of the cognitive protocols and frameworks that I build with them, and some of them are on my Twitter, which is just helping you understand where certain aspects of identity come from, for instance. And then that's basically the service. So this is what I do.
Oh, perfect, man. You're like the nexus of everything that I'm interested in. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah.
So many interests in common, man. Health, fitness, nutrition, neuroscience, psychology, philosophy. That's my jam, dude. So I'm really glad you're here. Stuart, why don't you give yourself a quick intro for those who may not know who you are?
Sim, so you said you're 24?
No, I'm 34. I moved
Oh,
to Norway 24 years ago. Sorry, 10 years ago when I was 24. So
roger that, roger that. All right, well, I'm Stuart, and I study consciousness, and I think today we're here to talk about the concepts of good and evil,
Mm.
and sort of, put to the test young Sim's view of things, and kind of push these ideas around and see what comes out.
Perfect, dude, and thank you both, by the way, because this is something that I'm really deeply passionate about. I know Stuart knows this about me, but I suffered a lot of great evil as a child, right? And so it caused me to, both when I was religious and also agnostic slash atheist, contemplate what is the nature of good and evil, and questions of rights. Stuart and I go back and forth all the time about government, and do people actually have something called unalienable rights? Do you have property in your body? Do you have something that others may not do to you period, without committing a moral transgression. And so we've been like exploring this a bunch, and I think Stuart knows, like, I think he's got some blind spots around this, and I know I probably do as well. And I think one of the best things in the world is to get a bunch of really smart people together that are good faith actors, bring their perspectives to the table. So I'm excited for this conversation. So I want to start those. And Stuart, you recommended we all pull up in chat, and also you've been chatting with us on X chat this morning. Um, why don't you kick us off? Why don't you tell us what you've been thinking about with respect to what I just laid out?
Excuse me. Well, anybody who has gone any distance down this rabbit hole as far as morals, ethics, sort of the formal philosophy, the history of it, of course, you're going to start getting into formalized religions, and we have what we have. We have some records of formalized religions, pre-Christian, Egyptian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Greeks. I mean, we have a great deal of literature that we can reference when we're talking about these things. And this represents thousands of years of discussion and understanding and different cultures' kind of views of these concepts, good and evil. So my basic position, which I'm going to try to, you know, install into your brains during this conversation, because it's not a directly intuitive position, and it's not really something I think that is it's not something that you can really pull out. Like if you just read the religious texts and you read the moral philosophers, this is not, my view is not something that would naturally drop out of that. And I think the reason is because those texts are sort of they define sort of the data on the curve, the things that sort of people have agreed upon, sort of the mean understanding of people aggregated over time. And I think to really understand good and evil, you have to understand that, but you have to understand the data off the curve. You have to understand the latent space. You have to sort of explore the latent space surrounding these ideas so you can understand the good and evil. So that's kind of what my view of this is done. I think it's sort of fleshed out this from an almost binary belief in right and wrong, and good and bad, and good and evil. I think there's a lot more nuance in there, and I think that's why people have become so confused, is because they don't allow for the stochasticity of good and evil. They want to frame it as these binary categories, and I don't think that they are binary categories, so they cannot be framed that way. Um, so the framework which I've developed is very much a biological naturalism framework where you view good and evil in the context of sort of biology, biophysics, the architecture of biological systems, and we view the social organism as sort of a scale invariant elaboration of what goes on in biology. And the way social organisms self-organize, the gradients, hedonic gradients that lead us to that self-organization can be directly mapped onto the protocols that organize, self-organize, and control the behaviors of biological synchronized cellular populations. I think good and evil, if we're going to have a formal definition of it that's useful and it's generalizable to any group of human beings, you have to go to the scale of biology. You can't look at it at the scale of individual cultures and individual points of view, because those are always influenced by environmental factors, which are going to change. The Egyptian environment that they lived in is very different than the United States environment that we live in, right? So we're going to have different cultural views based on our environmental conditions. But I think that if you're going to understand good and evil, we have to get beyond that. We have to get down to the level of biology and describe how these categories of ideas are generated sort of at a more primitive level. And then we sort of make up all these stories about it at these higher levels. But I think digging down to the primitive levels from which they emerge is the only way you're ever really going to understand it.
Got it. Okay. I have some thoughts around that, but to not poison the well, I'd like to have Sim respond to that. What do you think, brother?
Well, like, I mean, so for me, like, I'll from the onset, I agree on the premise that like these things don't come from anywhere, right? It kind of has to make sense from the bottom up. I spend a lot more of my time looking at effectively in affect neuroscience and kind of like, what actually what Stewart said that would come later down the line, because of our interests are also aligned but diverged, and my knowledge is obviously less than Stewart in the field of consciousness, and a lot of these structures come beforehand, right? So I can't make any grand claims about that. So whenever I'm conceptualizing things, I try to work from what I know from papers that I've read and books that I've read about, like how mainly in terms of identity formation in things of psychopathology, and how there's like hereditability, so that also speaks to like things in genes, um, and that obviously like things are driving this, right? And an environment has driven a certain impulse before, um, somewhere down the line that then gets carried as an adaptive behavior because it must have been functional to some degree at some point to have been selected and kept being selected at a certain level. So that's kind of how I've conceptualized it, partially, let's say.
Got it, got it, and that makes sense to me, and I agree, generally with both of you. I think this is something that is emergent, right? Ethics and morality, and this is a distinction I really wanna make because Stewart talks about good and evil, and I think the waters get very muddy unless we're
Mhm.
crystal clear with our definitions, which is why I like to separate, like Kant did, and have the hypothetical imperatives separated from the categorical imperatives. Although I don't agree with Kant on categorical imperatives, there is this categorization, and I think this comes to speak about the natural rights, right? This talks about negative rights that people have, meaning Sim may not do this list of things to me, may not punch me in the face, may not kidnap me, may not assault me, may not rape me, may not steal from me, right? Like these are prohibitions, and they have to be, to to Stewart's point, they have to be universalized, regardless of culture. Like ethics, that's one of the things that's very, very important, is that they don't change from culture to culture. Morality, yes, like there's this sort of, like, to Stewart's point, the social organism has protocols that they've established, and they might vary from culture to culture based on the environment, based on the level of resource allocation available, based on whatever that we've evolved to drive the culture forward, right? But I'm talking about things that are truly universalizable, and that's where I guess I focus most of my time, because we can have plenty of discussions and we can have plenty of good faith rational discussions about what the good looks like, what we think the good should be. Like how should we behave as a society? How, what should we, how should we conceptualize charity, for example? How should we conceptualize, what we would constitute as good behavior, moral behavior, things that are pro-social, things that build up society versus things that tear them down. That's a great conversation to have, but to me, that's not so interesting. And I think it's also where things get muddied because people don't have crystal clear boundaries between those two categories. So either one of you step in and let me know what your thoughts are on that.
Um, I'll go ahead if that's okay, Sim.
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay, so you're defining ethics as generalizable protocols of behavior that transcend situations. It's not situational.
Well, it is, right. So the study of ethics, obviously, there's gradients, as you mentioned. Like everything is not 100% black and white, and this is the job of the philosopher, right? Is to suss this out and tease it out, find your edge cases, find your boundaries, because it's not always so clear. But there's certain things that I think are incredibly universal, with respect to these prohibitions. If you look at the entire planet, and this is what's super interesting to me about ethics, is that no matter where you go, no matter what school of thought you're coming from, what religious tradition you're coming from, people have arrived at the same conclusion around murder. Yeah, that's wrong. Rape, that's wrong. Then, but you can get into these categories. Well, what constitutes rape? Well, it's somebody having sex with you against your will, right? But then people start talking about, well, what about statutory rape? And when is the age of, I mean, you can start teasing that apart, but I'm just talking about really coarse grained categories: murder, theft, rape, assault. These things have been universally agreed upon.
Why do you think they are universal that way? I mean, what do you attribute that universality to? Is sort of in a primitive level? I mean, why is that? I mean, not like in a psychology or sociological framework, but it's just a more primitive reason why something like these ethics, these protocols that you think are sort of scale free, are so ubiquitous. Why do you think that?
Don't know if I know why I think that, right? Like I start with philosophy. So I've reasoned these things out from first principles, right? And by the way, I could be completely wrong. This is an incredibly difficult subject. Secular ethics, universal secular ethics is like the uh it's a holy grail of ethical philosophy, right? It's very difficult, and I think I called out, Stuart. I'm very big fan of Stefan Molyneux and his universally preferable behavior. That's really powerful. I don't know if he's right, but I think he makes some very good arguments, and I think that he differentiates himself a little bit from Kant in a good way, and has sort of corrected some of Kant's errors. But my view of this is it's something that we as a society, as human beings, observed and judged. Like we've always talked about, there's always an ideal at the top. There's this sort of like, that's what religions are, and this is why I loved your thread this morning, Stuart. Is like these religions have all been trying their best to sort of filter this up and figure out what this list of things that we can't do are. Um,
Mhm.
and we've all arrived at the same place, and it feels to me like as a people we've watched and then judged. Right? There's something that happens where we observe and then we recoil. There's something in us, and I don't know where it comes from, which is why I love talking to you guys because I'm not deep into the effect of neuroscience, and I'm not super deep in human psychology, although from a lay perspective, I probably know more than most. It seems to be emergent, and it seems to be like these are things that we've discovered in the same way that we've discovered the scientific method to tell us about the realm of facts. But there seems to be there's something that is in us that has this there's this judge that observes and judges and categorizes, and I don't exactly know where it comes from, but it feels like it's pretty hard to argue against it since these are ubiquitous across all cultures, across all societies. Every human in the world essentially arrives at that same list of coarse grain prohibited actions.
Sim?
Yeah. So as you point out, like there's something that's judging, right? And from what I know from effective neuroscience and just in general, the things that you can feel, and that's kind of like the key mark, right? There's a, excuse me, an affect to this. Um, and it seems like in a, uh, I'm not sure if I'm using this term correctly in this fashion, but in a neurotypical profile, so to say, that's kind of the norm, it seems, right? Like, okay, I have affect in a certain sense that somebody does something good, let's call it, and yay, right? I feel good. Obviously, like I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, but when somebody does something that feels wrong, then that's where we start going, okay, like that's not good, right? Like where evil then comes in is obviously like more of a gray zone as we've been talking about it. That's why I referenced psychopathology earlier, because that's kind of where you start seeing like, okay, these people, they don't seem to share the same type of systems of affect that, I mean, structurally they do. To a certain extent, you can have hypoactivation, which means lower, hyper, structural differences in terms of the size of certain brain areas. Um, and that's that's generally and basically where a lot of that signal gets lost, if we can call it like that. And that's, if we're working off the driver, as we were just talking about the feeling, if you can't feel that something is wrong even when you cognitively know it's wrong, yeah, then you're playing with a paradox. I mean, cognitively to a certain extent, because you're, well, I know this is wrong, and it's wrong by the decrees that we've just been talking about and that you highlighted. But then I don't feel anything about that. So what does that mean? Like I can't obviously model the nature of a psychopath in that regard. So I don't know if they're thinking if this is wrong or not. That's some of the stuff that's filtered back to me from some of the research papers. But at least the feedback seems to be that they don't feel that part, right? So the affect is different. So the boundaries being drawn in that regard, I think are very important because, um, as you kind of mentioned, like it seems that across most cultures and societies, even when some of the moral boundaries were more fluid, um, the general gist of it has been based in effect for quite some time. That's, what I have garnered.
Got it, and I agree with that, and I think that, as I'm listening to you speak and I'm thinking about what I just said, I think the other component of this is philosophical in nature, right?
Mhm,
Philosophy
mhm.
is what came after this, right? This sort of the initial feeling, right? This sort of like empathetic feeling towards watching something that is clearly evil. That caused us to think, and I think philosophy really got us to question, why do we feel this way? Where is this coming from? And like I said, that's where I think starting from first principles, like reducing everything from first principles and reasoning outward, allows us to potentially, like I said, I don't know if anyone's cracked this nut yet, but we should be able to discover the nature of it based off of that. And in my view, like inalienable human rights are very simple to suss out from first principles. If you accept certain axioms, like you own yourself, like your body, the boundary of your skin, your body belongs to you, and you control it. Like if you start there, and I don't think anyone will disagree with that. It seems like a self-detonating argument to say that. Well, no, I mean, unless you're like a strict determinist, right? Like that's a whole other can of worms. But it's not difficult to arrive at the same conclusions with respect to these prohibitions if you start with, hey, I own myself, and then nobody else, like Sim doesn't have a higher claim on my life than I do. From Aristotle's laws of logic, A equals A, Sim and I are identical. We are human beings. We're the same category. You don't get to have a separate set of ethics than me. You don't get a higher claim on my life to tell me what to do, to bully me, to assault me, to steal from me than anyone else does. That's kind of where I start from. So I think it's two things. It's that beginning phase, a sort of like ancient, emotional, compilation that really wasn't rigorous or philosophical in any sense, and it's sort of refined over time. And I think we're, maybe closer now to to figuring things out. But that's just my general thoughts.
Okay, well, that's all very interesting. I'd like to sort of talk for a second about sort of like the structure of my understanding and my belief and my view of effective neuroscience, and sim is sort of down that same rabbit hole. You might find this useful or explanatory. So, Mark Soms talks a lot about the most elemental form of consciousness is affect, basically feelings, which, I use the term hedonic valences, things that feel like something and they're valenced and they're positive and negative, right? That is the most foundational form of consciousness, right? So I think I proceed from that as sort of a given that in biology, the most fundamental form of experience is hedonic. It feels like something. That feels good, that feels bad, sort of bacterial approach avoidance, kind of binary, decision trees. And that decision tree grows more complex and grows more nuanced, and more categories of hedonic experience develop as you aggregate biological modules, cells, and multicellular organisms. So, but at the most elemental form, there is that affect. So, understanding that affect, understanding those hedonic valences, sort of creating a philosophy and a metaphysics of that off the curve, off the formalism. You have to understand the formalism, but you also have to be able to understand things off the curve. That's what philosophy and metaphysics is you're basically leaving the formalism and exploring that latent space that formalism implies, right? So, I think everybody does that to a certain extent, and some are more successful than others. But what I've done is basically think of this in terms of everything inside of, just taking the human being as a sort of n equals one, a test case of this sort of idea. Everything inside of you is judging and predicting based on hedonic valences. That's the experience everything inside your body is having. Think about the implications of that. Okay. Your body does not communicate linguistically. Your body communicates hedonically through these valenced categories of experience. And their behavior is in effect, there is affected by those hedonic valences. So by speaking language, thinking in language, metacognitively structuring our thoughts in language, we in effect disassociate ourselves from our bodies. Okay. And I think that's a big reason why we have such a hard time figuring this shit out, especially when we're talking about affect and hedonic valences, because we're using linguistics to describe something that it's sort of a weird loop going on there because we're imbuing the linguistics with hedonic valences and using that to describe the hedonic valences. So it's this weird recursive thing you're doing, which can get very complicated and people get very upset when you talk about emotions. You have no idea. I've talked to people about emotions for my entire adult life, and people get very upset if you start talking about emotions generally, right? And I think that's why, is because you're doing this weird thing to them that they don't want to do. They don't want to talk about it that way. But you have to talk about it that way or you can't understand it. So you're asking, where does this sort of assignment of good and bad come from? And why is it ubiquitous among cultures? Why is these sort of ethical protocols that you think are so generalizable, why are they so ubiquitous? Okay. And I think it is because everything inside your body is assigning hedonic value to all your experiences. And that is a feed forward process. So when your baby's born, your baby's genome is updated with all of your experiences plus all of the instinctual memory you had. That is what you're born with, this sort of hedonic value system, which represents the instinctual hedonic value system of your entire species going before you. And that's why we all share it, because we're all in the same freaking species, so we have the same basic priors hedonically. Okay. So that's why I think when cultures, you put them in any sort of environment, they're going to assign hedonic value based on that shared hedonic value system based on our instinctual memories, right? That makes sense?
100% makes sense. And here's a question I want to ask you is, and this is where I think it gets very tricky for people. Because if you accept your premise, and I do, you have to understand that ethics is there to arrest hedonic impulses, right? So when you have two individuals that have differential uh, hedonic preferences, right? For example, like if I'm over here, it would feel very good to me to steal Sim's shit and to have it for myself. Right, like that is like my body will react as like I have more resources now from a purely evolutionary perspective. I can maybe, if it's enough shit I've stole, I can attract a better mate and I can procreate. And there's all of these things that are baked in. And so there is sort of, and obviously Sim is going to be like, no, that's bad. Hedonically, I'm going to react negatively. That valence will tilt negative for him. And we have a diametrically opposed hedonic valence, right? And that's what ethics does is it sort of grounds and standardizes and says, hey, fuckers, no, like this, I understand that it feels good to rape somebody, but no, they own themselves. It's not your body to control, right? So that's where I want to poke at you, Stuart. Is like I get the drive, I get all this complex biological machinery that is saying, hey, this feels good, this feels bad. But ethics is like it's meta. It's above that. It is like, hey, we're not talking about what feels good and bad in the moment. We're talking about is something actually prohibited? Is it right or wrong? Is it categorized that way?
Yeah. The tricky thing about the individual emotional inventory and being a human being more generally is that we're so closed off in this Markov blanket, right? The human body creates a sort of what's called an attractor state, this persistent personality that's very, powerful to us as human beings looking out, right? And so the hedonic valences, we have a tendency, or we can have a tendency to view those as personal. When actually those hedonic valences are not personal, they are intersubjective. They are not intended to be used by you personally. They are intended as protocols to function within a social organism intersubjectively. But when you isolate that into this individual, all of a sudden they don't have any meaning anymore, and you make up all these meanings for them. Like, I want to have sex with that woman, so I'm going to go do it. But your hedonic value system says don't do that, but you're like, fuck it. I want to do that because you're in a pathological state. Anybody who is an isolated mind, isolated from intimacy with the social organism, that's why they're in. That's, you know how, Brent, how I say that is a pathological state. That's why it's a pathological state, because your hedonic value system is intended to function as protocols in an intersubjective social organism. It's not intended to function as you, one asshole, and what you want to do. That's not the intention of it. It's the aggregation of millions of generations, and it has nothing to do with you. You know, your feelings, your emotional inventory has nothing to do with you and everything to do with how you relate intersubjectively to other people. Okay. That's why you have this sort of approach avoidance, positive, negative. This feels good. This feels bad as far as social hedonics go. That's sort of your emotional inventory telling you how to self organize correctly. Don't go over there and punch him. Why? It's going to piss him off. And that's going to create all these problems in the social organism. Don't have sex with his wife. Why? It's going to piss him off. It's going to ruin the relationship. They have children. Your emotional inventory has heuristicized these things into these sort of valences, these feelings. But they're telling you what to do. They're providing behavioral gradients to self organize within a social organism. That's what they are, right?
I don't think I've got any pushback on that. Like, I agree functionally with how they emerged and what they're there for, and including all of the shit in our genome that's been accumulated, right? Guiding our instincts and all this stuff. It's baked in. I get all of that and stuff. There's programs that we're not even aware are running. I understand all of that. And oftentimes that stuff's baked in because we've tried that experiment and it didn't go so well, right? Right. The things that went well for us tend to get carried forward. I understand all of that. But the problem I'm having with you, Stuart, is that there doesn't seem, if you take that approach and you look at things only from a quote unquote social organism perspective, which is super hard to figure out what that even means because we have so many different scales of social organization, particularly now, without any sort of universalization. How can you possibly function as a society if you have differential ethics for different people? Like that, number one, it's irrational, right? Like from a philosophical standpoint, like that is completely irrational. It's not logical at all, so it can't be right. Uh, and so I'm just trying to. I think it's where you and I get sideways of each other. Is like I'm like look, like I think that respecting these sort of prohibitions, not raping, not killing, not fucking, or sorry, murdering. Killing's fine if it's defensive, but not raping, not murdering, not stealing. All the coarse grained things we called out, those should be respected absolutely. That's the most pro social way to organize society, in my view. And I might be wrong. Like that's just the way I see it.
Are you under the impression I disagree with you?
Oh, clearly, you do. We have disagreed about this, right? Because your claim is that the individual is subservient to the collective, or the social organism, right? You're not the single asshole, right? Like you're not on an island, so you have to conform to what the group says. And on top of that, there's this group that has a special, a differential ethics. They get to actually, no, sorry, opposite ethics. The people called government, they get to murder, they get to steal, they get to imprison and kidnap and do all these sorts of things. And that's just completely illogical. It violates the universalization principle, and it is very difficult for people to see this, right? Because it's like a fish swimming in water that's not even aware of the water. This is what we've grown up with. It's like, oh yeah, there's this guy with a badge and a costume, and he gets to act completely with opposite ethics as me because of reasons. It's typically utilitarianism. That's the sort of ethical framework these people operate by. Is like, well, like, yeah, it's evil, but we gotta because reasons. That's kind of what the typical argument, tends to sort of go down. And I'm not a utilitarian. Like, I think that there's actually, something called unalienable individual rights, and they should not be violated at all. Like that, it's the best way to organize society, the most pro-social way. But most people just come up with problems like why they just disbelieve like this. We could never have a society where that operated in such a way. We have to organize by violence, and I reject that. Like I don't think that's right.
I don't. I think I haven't explained myself well. I mean, I don't approve of these things that you're describing. I'm just acknowledging that they exist. And it's as a practical matter. I'm not saying that, I agree that these are good things or that they are necessary or even inevitable. I'm just saying they exist. And as a practical matter, we have to acknowledge that. But I think what you're talking about, and I sort of have thought about this quite a bit since starting to talk to you, and sort of, kind of how to bridge my view with your view, And I think a lot about scale, as far as like we're talking about the function of hedonic valences and the intersubjective nature of those protocols. There is a boundary on scale where those apply. I think it's like ant colonies. If you know anything about ant colonies, there's a certain size beyond which they can't grow, or that the protocols by which they function are no longer functional. Right. So that's why there's a limit to how, that's why the whole world is a giant ant bed. It's because there's a limit on the size that those protocols will allow that social organism to grow. I think human beings have exceeded the
Yeah.
appropriate size of the social organisms. I think that our emotional inventory, our hedonic value systems are not intended to be applied at this scale. And I think at the most primitive level, that's why we have this problem. And we can argue about all the details of what, of that problem. But I think if you track it back down to the most fundamental reason, that's the reason. It's just scale. Our emotional inventory is not intended to function with billions of people. Okay. It's just not the way it works. And to do that is like trying to create an ant bed that's too big. You're just going to have a mess,
Can
because those protocols are intended to function at that scale.
I
So,
add to that?
yes, please.
So you're reading the attachment compass, right? So in it, I make a similar case. It struck me that from the Dunbar and a few other ones, they go over this like scaling system, right, of social circles effectively. In Plato's laws, he also has a capacity on the city precisely for this reason.
Right.
Because we as Stuart makes the case, and I actually fully agree, you don't have the bidirectional or scaled feedback loops of responsibility or accountability, rather. I think that's a better way to put it. And you would see that in, um, like, I want to use the term natural, but yeah, in natural hierarchies, that everyone was responsible and accountable for everything up and down the scale. And you see that in attachment, as Stewart just put forth, that you can only care about X amount of people and you only have that much bandwidth. Like, it's not just in terms of energy, like it's also in terms of attention. It's in terms of your resources as oxytocin, dopamine, and so forth, right? So when it comes to that variance, I mean, that is quote unquote rate limited, right? There's a capacity there. And when we exceed that capacity, you have all that disconnect, right? That gap, which makes it makes it easier for bad agents to leverage. And I
Mhm.
think, I mean, it's not like the Belgian government is perfect. So you see that across, Europe, the US, wherever, that as soon as this disconnect happens, then the bad actors in these pictures, right? How Jesus Christ, sorry. However, they get selected through certain processes in terms of dispositions, that they get into positions where, well, I'm not accountable. I can do what I want, and we've had corruption cases, right? It's essentially all the same anywhere. So I agree with the initial assessment. Like, that's a difficult problem to tackle because, and I've thought about that extensively as well. Like, how do we scale that back in the sense? Um, and I don't have an answer to that, by the way. Like, I haven't come to any conclusion.
Yeah, and I agree. I don't have an answer either because essentially what you're describing is, from my perspective, is you're asking the question, what do you do about it? Right? I think we sort of identified there's some problems here. When you give this group of people called the government essentially the gun to point at everybody and force, as Tolkien pointed out, the ring of power corrupts. It turns you into a golem, right? Like no human. That's why I love the analogies in there. No human could carry the ring. It had to be a hobbit. It's like no human can handle the power. It's such a brilliant analogy, and it's ultimately corruptible and at scale as we keep growing the scale outward. I completely agree with both of you. Like, human societies were not meant to be at this level of connectedness. Like, that's just not what our brains have evolved to do. Um, but ultimately, you have a Mexican standoff. Essentially, it's like, when you say, like, let's say tomorrow you guys both agree with me. It's like, yeah, we really should get rid of government. It's like, okay, well, how do you put down the gun? Who's going to put down the gun first? because everybody in America, I know, Stuart, you know this, like everyone is so hyper attuned right now to the other side. What happens if we don't vote for our guy? We need a strong man to fight them, and then when they fuck us, we're gonna fuck them harder next time. And this completely this escalating thing. And to think to some, to have somebody think, I'm actually going to lay down the gun first. I'm not going to vote. We're going to extract from the system. We're going to try to develop alternate, functions. Whatever functions the government delivers today, like policing. If you break it down, it's like, okay, well, we need protection. We need somebody to protect our property. We need someone to protect our person. To think for half a second, it's like, oh, wow, how could we do this if we deployed what we have in the free market and had competing companies that had, technology that you would agree to? Maybe you would agree to allow this company to surveil you more than you would the government, right? Because you care about your family, and you can cancel your service if you want and switch to a different provider. It keeps them honest. The other guy's going to call out this guy if they're doing something fucked up. With government, you don't have that, and you can't cancel your service. All these things are forced on you. If we wanted to move to re-envision the way we sort of organize society, it seems almost impossible. Like, I get your point. There's not really a way forward I can see. I make the argument all the time, but to say to somebody, everyone set your guns down and trust the other people, I don't think that we have that today. And this is one of the pernicious, effects of government is that gun. Everyone is just, and even you've seen the Charlie Kirk assassination. That was one of the things that he said. Like, I stopped being a libertarian because I realized there's a gun on the table, and if I don't grab it, the other guy's going to grab it. And to me, this seems like the intractable problem. I don't think that there's any issue with us organizing at a smaller scale without some sort of 300 million people lumped into one country, and it has to be this way. We could have smaller cells of people. I don't know if you know Michael Malice, but he's got a great quote. He says, "Anarchy isn't a location; it's a relationship." Like, we don't have to have these sort of like archaic, strict boundary lines, and everybody within these boundaries has to behave the same way and has to choose exactly the same things. But to get to anything where we can remove that scale problem and start having more local communities, or having a differential way of engaging with each other, like, we first got to put down the gun, and I don't see anyone doing that.
Mm. Well, I mean, I'm a big proponent of, when you're looking at a problem, the observer is half of that equation. All right. Who are we? What are human beings as an observer? And what is this problem we're looking at? Okay. So, I mean, science is great here because science is sort of like the species scale view of reality. That's what empiricism is. We all agree. We can all look at a ball rolling down a hill and measure it and say, yeah, it goes that fast. That's sort of like the species scale perception. And that's why a lot of people enjoy and like and are drawn to empiricism, is because it sort of has this universality to it, right? And we are all a shared observer. But I mean, when you're talking about social problems like this, I think it's the same kind of thing. You need to understand, what is a human being? What is this thing that has the problem? And you have to sort of step outside of it and look back at yourself and as an observer. Okay. So, I mean, when I think about it like that, I think of human beings, first of all, we're animals and we come from natural ecosystems. Okay. Our entire biological hedonic value system, the majority of it, 99% of it, evolved within natural ecosystems. And that is where those protocols were developed,
Hmm.
embedded within the natural ecosystems of the world, not in civilization this way. Okay, so that is an enormously important thing about the observer, the human being that's making this sort of asking this question, what to do. Okay, so what do we know about natural ecosystems? And what was it like to be a human in those natural ecosystems? You got to think, first of all, the ecosystem constrained the population size just by the nature of predatory ecosystems. The population was the only reason we're allowed to explode a number like this is because we've removed ourselves from natural ecosystems. We've minimized predation. We've created these artificial human ecosystems, right? And we need to start asking, was that a good idea? I mean, if you're going to do that, if you're going to leave the system in which you developed, in which constrained your sort of your capacity to develop pathology was constrained by that natural ecosystem. But we've left it now, and now we're sort of unconstrained in our ability to develop pathology. Well, that means we need to fucking get a hold of ourselves. as a species, and realize that's what's going on, right? And like people that have the capacity to think on this scale, that are good people that don't want, that want the human species to succeed at this weird experiment we've all kind of agreed to do. If we want us to succeed, we need to start thinking like this. This isn't about you or me or my kids or my wife. This is about our species. And if you're going to ask this question, you have to look at this question as if it's the species is the observer and the species is asking this question. It's not you, it's not me, it's not Brent. The species is asking this question. So to understand, to answer the question, you have to understand the species. You have to understand the self. You have to understand the meta self. And now that's kind of what I've been working on for the last 20 years. And my conclusion is that we have to realize that artificial human ecosystems have to be managed because we don't have the natural constraints provided by natural ecosystems. Okay. Now, this goes back to Brent's understanding of government. Why do we need government, Brent? Because you have removed the governance of natural ecosystems. Therefore, you have to have some sort of constraint in place or people will go freaking nuts. Okay. That's just the reality of the human condition. If there's no constraints, you're going to have this sort of unconstrained behavior. You have to have some sort of constraining gradients of behavior. That's what government provides. In small groups, you have sort of top-down parents, mom and dad, don't take a shit on my floor, and then you scale that up. But, yeah, I really think that understanding human beings, understanding the human condition, taking a no bullshit assessment of who we are, where we came from, what we are, and what is the state at which we would like to achieve. This state we're in right now, I think we can all agree this is stupid. This is not a state that we want to stay in. We want to evolve out of it. We want to find a different state. So what does that state look like? We have to ask that question. Because this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to end well if we just let it happen, sort of evolve with a bunch of, idiots running around doing stuff. We need to take control of this more purposefully. And I think that's what elites are trying to do in their own stupid way. I mean, think about what they're trying to do. They're trying to downsize the population. Now, if we were psychopaths and we were a bunch of, Rothschilds or whatever, having this conversation, and when what we thought actually affected the world, we might come to the conclusion the only solution is to downsize the population. And that's what they're doing. It doesn't look pretty from the lower levels here. They're like, okay, you're killing people, but you have to do something. And I don't think that's the solution. I don't, obviously. But I really think that the people that are at the top of the social dominance hierarchies in the elite classes or whatever, I think they are thinking on this scale. I think they are thinking about what to do because this is not sustainable. It's not a good place to be, and we need to purposefully move from it to something else, and that's what they call their new world order. You know, which is a downsized population with more centralized control, where protocols are more manageable. They can manage these. Right now, it's not manageable, right? So you kind of see their point, even though the way they're doing it is evil.
And
But
it results in them just enriching themselves further.
of course it does. But that's incidental, right? Because they have good intentions. Everybody thinks they're good. They're doing the good thing, right? Just incidental that they're going to be in charge at the end of this little idea.
Gollum. It's just Gollum, man. I
Yeah.
want to say something though, real quick, Stuart. I don't think you intentionally strawmanned me, but you totally strawmanned me. I hear this constantly, and I think this goes down to the fact that we've had this sort of government indoctrination just shoved down our throats since day one. It's Bastiat had a famous quote about this too, about the socialists, like, hey, just because we opposed to socialized medicine, people accuse us of not wanting to have medicine at all. It's like, no, that's not the argument. I'm not saying there doesn't need to be governance or doesn't need to be a way to organize, structure society, have consequences for violating ethical norms. That's not what I'm saying. I'm proposing a different path forward, right? So when you think of it this way, like the elites are proposing one way. We all know it's broken. They're saying more control, more communist central planning. That's the way we're going to tighten the thumb screws. I'm like, hey, how about we try freedom? How about you give people choice and let people self organize? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the social organism wants what it wants. It wants predictability. It wants the ability to trade with its neighbors and to enrich itself and to gather resources and all these things, take care of its family. It's just a matter of like what mechanism. So I believe in governance, clearly believe in governance. It's a great thing, but I don't believe in government. And the difference between the two is one of them has a gun pointed at people and says, I will shoot you if you disagree. And I think that is the most antisocial way of organizing society. So I want to be clear. I want a system of justice where you choose, right? For example, Stuart and I are going to get into a contract. I'm going to sell him my widget and he's going to pay me X amount of Bitcoin or whatever it is. I want to have in the contract an agreed upon adjudicator. Like you're going to have some sort of binding arbitration or something. A company will resolve the dispute. We both agree to it when we enter into the contract. And there's enforceability. And eventually those guns are going to come out if one of us commits fraud or backs out and goes against our word. There's going to be some sanctions, there's going to be some teeth, but I just really hate this idea that anarchy means chaos and anarchy means no rules and it means no structure and no governance. I think that's complete bullshit and people accept it. And that's actually why I don't use the word anarchy very much. I use voluntarism, which is really a synonym, but I think anarchy is so polluted by the fucking Antifa people and the black bloc retards. I don't want to be lumped in with those idiots.
I don't lump you in with idiots. I don't think you're using the right word. I don't think anarchy describes what you're trying to describe, but at least my understanding of that
Why
word.
not?
Well, simply because of the sort of the way that that word is understood colloquially.
Well,
Whatever
that's my complaint, right? Like it's not the word is wrong, it's the colloquial
well,
misunderstanding of
that's
the
it.
word,
You can't escape that colloquial understanding. You know, that means every single time you call yourself an anarchist, you have to define what you mean because the word you're using isn't the right word. You need to
which is
find
why I
another
use
word
voluntarist. Voluntarist is perfect. I'm fine with it. The problem is it's the opposite of the colloquial problem. It's like nobody fucking understands what voluntarism is. So it's I got to catch
Right,
22.
right. Sim thoughts?
I mean, it's interesting. I share a lot of the same sentiments around the governance and being governed by something that I can align with, or having an actual leadership. It's I mean, I've lived in Belgium, I've lived in Norway, I've been in many different places. You guys have as well, right? From Brent, you talked about your travels. Um, like it's for us, right? So I'll speak broadly and generally as a European for a second, because it's the only reference point that I have. The Swiss seem to do a pretty good job in terms of this decentralized way of deciding about your area, right? Their cantons, which I've been fascinated by for quite some time, precisely because it works pretty well. Um, Considering everything, it's you still have a unification of the culture. I mean, there's certain discrepancies, of course, because of the language differences, and I'm not an expert on Switzerland. I've been there a few times, but that's about it. But I've been looking into it, and it's so I'm always also trying to synthesize, like, why don't we have these types of things here? Belgium is a very complex country in terms of governance, by the way. Also because of different language zones, which kind of begs the question why we never took a federalized system like they have, because each canton has the authority and responsibility for things that they want to have happen there. So very often when we talk about systems in this sense, and it's kind of the same way with laws, or at least the way I relate to it, where it's like, okay, it's not really like this, that we don't know that these systems are there or that they can even function. It's other issues, as we have been describing, that certain people that have control either are unwilling to let go of control, have an alternative plan, an alternative thinking method, right? So yeah, I let's say that I struggle with that ideologically or politically when I know that, and I've been to Switzerland. I'm not going to say that it's perfect, right? But it's very chill, and I've liked all my stays there. It's very cool that they just can collectively decide on what happens in their region, and it's something that, for my region in Belgium, I've had a lot of issues with the municipality actually because of things that they were doing. Where I'm like, I don't support that. I don't think it's a good idea. In Norway or in Oslo, less they also make their mistakes, obviously, but I feel less encroachment or less misalignment of values. So yeah, that's just my experiences on top of it because of these. I am for freedom in that sense or in agency. It's obviously a big part of my job as well, how to bring that more to a person, as when you put all of these things together, because of where kind of we started our dialogue, right? Like, you are a person with certain rights, and I'd like to foster that in a person. So then it's, to me, there's like logical, let's say, steps in scale there as well, where that's why I said that I think the Swiss are doing a pretty decent job at making that more accessible. Um, yeah.
And ironically, the Swiss are the most prosperous country in Europe too, by a wide margin.
Yeah.
I'm in tech, and I pay very close attention to salaries. That's something I watch carefully, and I have employees that are in Europe, and it's quite funny. The same individual, with the same job title and the same level, will make less than half in Ireland that they make in the United States, and on top of that, Ireland tax them at like 60%. And I'm shocked at how poor Europeans actually are. I think that's something that
Yeah.
people misunderstand. They see a lot of the beautiful architecture and these
Yeah.
amazing
Yeah.
buildings, and you go as a tourist, and you're bringing your American money, and it feels so great. And then one of the best things I advise people to do when they go to Europe is stay at an Airbnb. Stay at somebody's house and compare that to your lifestyle in America. It's very different. But in Switzerland, the salaries are almost comparable to the United States, and the society seems very, very healthy and prosperous compared to the rest of Europe.
Like, that's my experience. A lot of, Belgium, France, Germany. I mean, we've all had serious governance issues, and I believe, right, I can be wrong about that, but it's the Swiss actually have an input, and they've been able to, yeah, keep the boat off of certain policies that have really had a very negative impact on our neighboring countries, and the lifestyle. And like, when we were talking, or you were talking about it, Brent, that they still have, like, I mean, it's not that big of a country, but they're very cohesive in their identity and in their values. There's not that much discrepancy, for as far as I can tell or see. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but that's what I found interesting, that, like, okay, we kind of give you guys the same amount of freedom, and you guys are all kind of choosing the same thing, right? Within margins. So there has to be, I mean, there clearly is something, as harkening back to the beginning of the conversation, something that we organize around and work our way towards.
Yeah, naturally, I think that exists, and I think Stuart and I will probably both agree that multiculturalism can be a net positive, right? But sort of forced multiculturalism at accelerated scales can be absolutely devastating for a culture. Stuart, you want to talk to me about that? I know you have opinions on that.
Well, I mean, the things that I think we're talking about are, they have primitives. They have things that, to really understand them, you have to like go down to the primitives. And, I'm a big believer in the free energy principle as a really important primitive that sort of sets up the structure of understanding for everything else that you're talking about, right? So when you talk about the free energy principle, you're talking about different states of a system, right? So, first of all, everything has a Markov blanket that separates what's inside from the outside. That's what it means to be a thing, right? And the nature of that Markov blanket is it has sensory states that interpret the hidden states in the environment that cause the things it's sensing, right? Because it can't see or understand everything, but it has sensory states that interprets, about what's going on outside of that Markov blanket, right? And that sort of general idea is what reality is. Everything in reality is doing that down to the level of electrons. That is the sort of organizational principle upon which reality is fundamentally structured. Okay. So I think it's important to understand that then. If everything is structured on that, you can almost reference that in any sort of situation. So in this situation, when you're talking about human government and good and evil and morality and ethics, and then under the free energy principle, what you're talking about is what's called attractor states. Attractor states are states that a system will return to because it is homeodynamically beneficial. All right. So it might could become out of equilibrium because of free energy, but it always returns to these attractor states. Okay. For Stewart, my personality, my consciousness is my attractor state. And my entire body, I am the primary attractor state in this organism. In my entire body, all those other attractor states down below me are in service of Stewart, of my personality saying stable and returning to this attractor state. That's why we're persistent. That's why you'll always be Sim and you'll always be Brent and I'll always be Stewart unless my wife kills me or something. I'll always be me, right? So when you're talking about society, when you take it out to you take that idea up to the scale of the social organism, of the scale of governance and everything, what you're talking about is competing attractor states. Okay, when you're talking about mixing cultures, they have an attractor state they want to be at that is in contradiction with the attractor state of the native culture. So they're going to fight it out. Which attractor state is going to win? Because they can't coexist together. And this is just mathematically definable. This isn't my opinion. This is just the basic thermodynamics of that situation. And, I think once you break it down to that level, you see the intentional malignancy. Once you're like, wait a
Mhm.
second, if this is so obvious, why is this happening? It's because the people doing it know that. It's because that's the intention of doing it, because they're not stupid. They know what they're doing. It's just this is not immediately obvious. It's not easy to articulate. And when you do it at that scale, we're slow to respond because we don't want to be racist. And they've really front loaded that.
Mm.
If you don't like your country slow motion invaded by millions of immigrants, you're racist. So it's basically warfare slowed down. I mean, if a million refugees invaded your country in a week and burned all your churches and raped all your women, that's war. But you do it over 10 years, that's immigration. And if you complain, it's racist. So there's this funny little game they're playing with us where they decide, because the nuclear weapons, we can't have the traditional warfare. So let's just slow it down. Let's do the same thing. We're just going to do it over 10 years instead of 1 week. And it's the same outcome. We just got to be patient, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and this is why I oppose utilitarianism. This is why I oppose government, right? If you give somebody access to that ring of power, they are going to misuse it. And giving a single person or group a monopoly on the initiation of violence in a country of 300 million people like America, that is always, from a utilitarian perspective, going to end in a disaster. They're going to, if they have the ability to force Stewart and me and everybody else to do X, Y, and Z, they can engineer society for their ends. Like, and I really oppose that. And this is why I love decentralization, why I love individuals being respected and having choice, being able to self organize. You can adapt. These social organisms at a smaller scale can adapt, they can respond. You can say, fuck you, this is my property, you're not welcome here. Or conversely, this person or this group, you're welcome here. Like, you have the choice. You can, and I think you see this sort of uh real-time response, almost like an immune system. Like, we have the ability to evolve and adapt. We can be flexible. Whereas government, number one, is nefarious, and it's meant to enrich the elite class, like you're talking about, at everyone else's expense, while they trot out their left and right parties, which are really the same party, to get people fighting with each other, keep them occupied while they're, looting everybody in the back room. I think that is, from a utilitarian perspective, which is often the argument I get pushed the most against my position, which is like, no, 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 we can't have freedom because otherwise bad thing X, Y, and Z would happen. I'm like, fuck, X, Y, and Z is already happening, guys. Like, it is all these horrible things are already happening. And to give somebody ultimate power and expect them to not misuse it in a nefarious way at your expense seems to me to be irrational and insane.
I think the
Well,
immune system thing was a good, like, analogy to that, right? That I mean, you see that in a local state or at a smaller scale, it's the same way. Like if something happened where
Mhm.
you mean socially, right? Like that could be obviously an example of immigration. It could be inside its own community. That like of course these exist to lesser degrees, but just to make the point, that if something happened where this circumstance was misaligned with the cultural value, like if you were of the same tribe, you would be excommunicated, right? If you
Yes.
were of another tribe, you would get executed. That is quote unquote the immune function working in order to get its homeostatic thing back in order, right? Like this thing went off off track, we bring it back. But and as you see or as you say, when that happens, I mean, you've seen this politically more often in the United States. You've seen some of it in Europe, and like I think some of it is hidden as well. But every time somebody tries to do that, they've also been pegged down, right, or taken down in that case, or knocked down, whatever the term would be properly. And effectively in the slow motion warfare, right? If you look at it like that, then yeah, if you disrupt the immune system of doing its job, then yeah, that's gonna cascade up and down the scale, giving serious problems because you can never reach, homeostasis if we're using more of the free energy principle vernacular in this way.
Man, you absolutely nailed it, and I think this is the problem nobody sees, is that by centralizing everything and having a monopoly control everything and saying, we can both have open immigration and by the way we'll give you a welfare state. You can come here and take resources for free. Europe is terrible about this too. Like just come on in, we'll pay for you. Like we used to have a society in America, I'll speak for America, where you had relief societies and you had churches and you had charities and you had orphanages that were privately run, and that immune function was there. If there was a bad actor, the local communities sniffed it out and like expelled these
Mhm.
people, and they would not give them free aid. They would be like, cool, we're here to help, but they would in a community sense, the social organism that Stewart talks about, it would operate optimally. It would say, look buddy, I understand you have alcohol problems, let's get you into treatment. Or I understand, you fell on hard times, you got sick, here's some help. But it wouldn't allow free riders. It would reject the free riders and this sort of pull, this gravity that would attract a bunch of free rider people that are not here to participate in the community, that want to subvert the community, that want to be antisocial, or even worse, want to impose their view, whether it be religious or whether it be cultural or something else, and force others to sort of adopt that by attrition, right? And with government, there's no brakes on that, and this is the problem I have. That immune function. I think it's a perfect analogy. It's like this response, this local response that gets
Mhm.
shut down. It gets dampened, and there's this giant fuck you, not only with force behind it with the government, but also culturally, which is obviously pushed by government. We know the U.S. aid and all these things that are, psyoping everybody into, oh, erase yourself, don't say anything because you're going to get called a bad word when you're really a good faith actor just trying to protect your society, right? Like I think this functionally is makes it impossible for us to get better as a society, because I always say to people, what are you going to do? What, are you gonna complain to the government? They don't give a shit. I mean, look at the Epstein situation. Like, the entire country is in unison saying, "Fucking give us the Epstein files," and the government says, "No," and we're just guess what? If you keep pushing it, I'm gonna give you distraction after distraction after distraction. I mean, Trump's talking about starting World War III this week. He will stop at nothing to distract from the Epstein files. Same thing with anything that people want. You can petition your government, and the leaders say, fuck you, we don't care. In this system, there's no consequence, there's no redress, there's no way to sort it out other than, as Stewart knows, at some point, if you get pissed off enough in America, we have guns and you can start shooting at people. But nobody wants to do that. That's not something that people really want to do.
Well, you can't really shoot at this problem, because it's
Not with
just
that
it's just
attitude.
well, I know you gotta want it. But, maybe we should bring this back around to good and evil, given all of that we've just talked about. What's the best way to understand these ideas of good and evil? Because I always talk about online, and this is kind of how we got into this conversation initially, is we have to have a formal definition of evil in order to have the immune response that you're talking about. And we all have to have a shared view of it. We all have to, when we see it, we have to be able to know what it is, right? And there's so many people these days that don't. If you ask them what evil is, they have no idea. And they'll give you examples of evil. They'll give you, sort of a maybe a cartoonish, biblical definition. Evil is the will of Satan or something like that. But you dig down a little bit, and people have literally no idea what that word means. Some people even don't think it exists. There is no such thing as evil. Everything is moral. Morality is relative. This sort of secular idea that evil doesn't exist. So, I mean, I really think that understanding these things in a formal way is necessary right now because we got some really confused people that don't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that
but
cutting the genitals off of children is evil. Somehow they don't understand that, and it's reached a point where we need to sort of say, okay, we have a problem. There's an enormous group of people that have no idea what evil is, and they are not responding appropriately to it. So that is why I've sort of started focusing on that because I see that as a real problem, like a very immediate problem that needs to be addressed.
I agree with you, but I disagree with the fact that people don't know, at least with coarse grain categories I called out earlier, the big ones. Everyone agrees on that shit, at least conceptually. If you
They
ask
know what
them, do
evil
you,
feels like. They know what evil feels like, but
no,
that's
no,
not
no,
the
I'm
same
saying like
thing as cognitively being able to talk about it.
ask anybody, do you believe murder is wrong? And everyone's gonna be like, yeah, fucking it's wrong. Do you believe rape of a child is wrong? Everyone's like, yeah, of course. Like there's these categories, these coarse grain categories everyone generally agrees upon until they get cognitively fucked up. Like I said, then you say, like, well, is stealing wrong? And they're like, yeah, 100% it's wrong. You shouldn't steal from people. It's like, well, what if the government does it? Then they're like, well, yeah, and so that's why I focus on ethics so much in those coarse grain categories. Because if I could get everyone to just ground on people have rights, man. Like you can't do this shit to people. Nobody can do this shit to people without committing a transgression. We could just agree on that. Give me like the five big ones, man. Don't even need the 10 commandments. Give me fucking five. And I think the world would be a much better place. But we constantly get squishy in our thinking. It's like, yes, they're wrong, but we got to do them because reasons. Like that seems to be where everybody instantly goes to. And if you accept evil can be done so that good can abound, I think that there's no end to the fucking darkness that's going to come from it.
It's also some of that like in group, out group happening
Mm.
in there, right? Which is also like as Stuart knows very well, like neurological separations that people make in these regards. So, because that's where the argument complexifies that, like, they know it's wrong, but not when it's their side doing it, right? And that, or if we put it like that, and that's kind of where it's like, okay, so it's to them, as I think Stuart said it, right? It's a subjective thing. It's not an objective thing or a universal thing. It's just like that person's bad. I mean, there's plenty of scores of examples of this, and then yeah, but like we've done, like now that that person has done that to that bad person, like my group is like yay, our group is like oh no, right? Like that's evil, and that's kind of like they know, but do they really know, right? So that's kind of like the question then. Like they seem to agree that murder is bad, but then you just had a political assassination, and then that's not for some. Then how do you how do you know, right? So that's yeah, like that's a very weird one in terms of like how do you really know then? Of if you know, then there's no real objectivity or an agreement as to where you place people in terms of their value.
Yeah, and I think you just highlighted exactly why ethics is so important because we do have that in group, out group preference, and we do have all this tribal bullshit that is baked in our DNA that helped us survive, but is not useful right now, and oftentimes gets manipulated against us. This sort of you just described American politics, this left quote unquote left right divide, even though basically everyone in America is a leftist today. It's teams. It's like I got an R team and I got a D team, and there's no sort of like boundary for what we won't do to the other side once we get power, and vice versa. And I think that is a well with no bottom.
I always like to. I mean, I'd like to say a couple of things here. And the first thing is understanding sort of the psychology of people. I've studied that my entire adult life, and I think a really interesting way to look at this is you have a lot of yourself exists at many scales, and your emotional inventory is forced then to function at different scales. Like I have the scale of Stewart. And I have an emotional inventory that dictates what Stuart does and what he likes and what he doesn't like, the clothes I wear, the food I eat, the kind of soap I use. This is an emotional inventory that is applicable at the scale of Stuart, right? And then I have the scale of my family. Now I have to, as a human being, take my emotional inventory and sort of create a virtual emotional inventory in my mind of Stuart and what he cares about at the scale of his family. So I have to abstract away from what I am to the scale of my family. Okay. That is very difficult to do. And most people fail at doing it because it's difficult to traverse the individual self to the scale of the family successfully and do it back and forth like that. That's sort of one of the artistry of being human. But that it doesn't end there, because then you have the scale of like your social group, which is another virtual level at which your emotional inventory has to function, which is different than the family level and the personal level, right? This is sort of the structure of the human psychology, is these scales of emotional inventory, these sort of virtual emotional inventories we create at every scale. So when you start abstracting far enough away from the self, your emotional inventory doesn't have that capacity to do it. You're full of shit. Like somebody who's president of the United States. I have an emotional inventory that has the capacity to function at the scale of 300 million people. No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have that capacity. You're full of shit. And no, that's why nobody can function at that scale, because a human individual does not have that capacity. Right? Okay. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is about sort of the definitions of good and evil. I think that they exist at those all of those scales. There's evil that exists at the scale of the self. There's evils I can do to myself. I can cut myself like people that have like cutting. I can hurt myself. That's evil at the scale of yourself. You're intentionally harming yourself, right? Then there is evil at the scale of the family. What if I molested one of my children? What if I beat my wife? That's another scale of evil, which, because I am destroying the functionality of that sort of attractor state that I'm supposed to be guarding and supposed to love, is whatever. And then you just sort of, that general principle is extended out to different scales. And the more it goes out, the less our emotional inventory has the capacity to model it. That's why we all get kind of confused, because we've exceeded our cognitive capacity, because our emotional inventory is not intended to function at that scale. Our emotional inventory is intended to function intersubjectively with small groups of people. Once you start sort of creating these virtual machines, these virtual emotional inventories at scales beyond human cognitive capacity, we are all full of shit. None of us can apply our individual emotional inventories at that scale, and people that pretend to are full of shit. And that's why we argue about it. You can argue about it endlessly. But that is the ground truth of that argument, is that you are full of shit. If you think that your personal emotional inventory has the capacity to apply to 300 million people, then you're full of shit. You are pretending that you can do that when you can't. Right. So what is evil? Well, I think evil is basically when you allow into any of those scales things that destroy its competency, destroy its functionality, destroy its ability to return to those attractor states that you're supposed to protect. Anything that interferes with that or actively tries to destroy it is evil. And it exists at different scales. It's individual scale, the family scale, the social scale, the world scale. Okay, so you can't talk about evil as in evil is killing people. That's a behavior. That is a symptom of evil. That is not evil. Evil is what I just described. It is this scale invariant um, force that tries to destroy the functionality of different attractor states at different scales. Right? It's a pathology. On the biological sense, it is a pathology. Anything that interrupts the functioning of a synchronized cellular population is a pathology. And that is basically evil in biological terms. It's the same thing with the social organism in human beings. And that's sort of my basic premise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does, and I think we've, identified some differences, because you seem to believe that you can commit an evil action to yourself, or you even conceptualize evil as not an action. Let me go that far. You said that it's not an action, it's a behavior or whatever, where all ethicists, like all philosophical ethicists, they talk about, that from a behavior standpoint, like an action can only be judged as good and evil. Right. So, for example, yeah, no, that's what everyone that's in the field of ethics believes. Like this, that's what ethics is for: is to understand what somebody may or may not do to another person. That's the functional utility of ethics. And so, your example of cutting yourself, I would say that's not evil. That is something in the category of aesthetic preferences, which I called out those two categories earlier. That is something that we can judge. It's like it's just like a Kant's hypothetical imperative. Like if your goal is to be a healthy human being, then you shouldn't cut yourself. Like that's a hypothetical imperative. It's
No,
not
I
in the
guess I,
category
I
of
guess
evil.
the root of the problem I'm having with the ethicist that you're referring to is that the source of all evil behavior is subjective. It's not objective. And I think if you look at it, that's obvious. You think and feel before you behave, right? So evil begins in the subjective space and then is performed in the objective space. So the individual is the most elemental form of evil. In a human social organism, the subjective state of human beings is the most primitive source of evil, which is what Jesus talked about. Is in fact what basically Jesus' entire shtick was. Stop worrying about worldly things. Stop worrying about what's inside here, your subjective states. Those are what's important. Not what you do, not good deeds, your subjective states. When you're lusting in your mind, you've already sinned, he said. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about these subjective states, which is the source of all of it. So if you want to address evil, you have to address the subjective states. If I'm cutting myself, that is a symptom of a subjective state pathology, which is going to extend to my family and to my society and everything. So that is the connection between the individual self-harm and sort of the larger scale invariant behavior of evil. It's the subjective state pathology that we call mental illness or whatever, right?
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't necessarily take too much umbrage with what you said. You're making kind of a metaphysical argument, right? Like that this sort of these subjective states predate action, but where the ethicists and where I land is like it doesn't matter as much until you get into the category of action. Right. So clearly, from your own self management standpoint, managing your subjective states, because we all have these impulses that arise and we have a prefrontal cortex that arrests those impulses. And we all wrestle with things that we wrestle with. And I think it's good. Like it's a hypothetical imperative. Like if we want to be good people, it's best that we ought to examine our subjective states and tamp down our impulses in order that we, might not do evil things in the world. Like that's a hypothetical imperative. Um, and I think it's good to do that, right? But ultimately, ethics don't matter until somebody gets impacted, right? Because the whole point of ethics is to identify when a transgression has happened and to do something about it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's sort of it's sort of ignoring the problem until it's right in your face. I mean, if you accept the premise that all evil behaviors are first begin in subjective pathology, I mean, there's no like perfectly balanced person that has a lovely subjective experience that suddenly wakes up one day and goes and rapes people. That doesn't happen. There's a causality there. And just because it's subjective doesn't mean it's not relevant or important or primary. So the subjective state is the primary state of evil, and everything else is secondary, tertiary to that. And that's sort of the Christian metaphysics. And that's why Christian metaphysics was so successful, I think, is because it was the first metaphysics that said, this isn't about what you do, this is about who you are subjectively. It's about what's in your heart, as they describe it, or whatever. It's your spirit, which to me, spirit just means consciousness. It is your subjective state. So I think that's a big problem with modern ethicists and moralists is that they refuse to view this as as functioning within a relationship between subjective and objective states. They don't even use that language. They just talk about behavior and they talk about where is your value where are these values coming from if you don't realize that subjective states are the source of it. Subjective states are the source of hedonic values that we assign value to everything. How do you even develop an idea about what morality and ethics is if you neglect that? So I think all the moralists and ethicists that you're talking about are full of shit because they are not addressing the fundamentals of this relationship.
I
Dito
disagree. Actually, I
also
think you misunderstand the function or the purpose of ethics, right? And it is about organizing society and it is about pro social behaviors and having some sort of guardrails because you can't, unless you're Peter Thiel and fucking Palantir, you can't do pre crime. You can't get into Stewart's head and understand what type of pathology is ruminating around in there that might manifest in behavior. You can only address behaviors. Like, for example, the guy that shot Charlie Kirk or whoever that might be. Um, it only matters when the action occurs, and there has to be, for example, let's take self-defense. Like, if we do not understand that humans have a right to not be aggressed against, and then Stewart comes at me with a knife and I shoot him, what just happened is an interaction that requires adjudication. It requires like some sort of judgment by society. Like, what are we going to do about this? Was I right to shoot Stewart? Or is there no such thing as ethics, and he can just do whatever he wants, right? Like, that's where the rubber meets the road and where it matters. And I don't
How does
disagree
that
with.
disagree with what I'm
It's
saying?
not
You're just
what
sort of you're just looking at the objective state. Are you saying that you don't believe that subjective states should be viewed as part of morality and ethics?
this goes down to the categorization between aesthetic preference and objective ethics, right? So I think that it is subjectively, or sorry, aesthetically preferable. It is good, right? For a colloquial term, it's good that Stewart keeps track of his emotional inventory, his mental states, and tries to arrest his impulses. Right, that's a good thing. If we want Stewart to not stab me in the neck, it would be best that he spent some time getting his shit together and making sure he doesn't
Not
go off the.
best. It won't happen if I do. If I am emotionally regulated and I am raised in an environment that promotes top down emotional regulation, I won't stab you. It is completely it's causally related. I mean, you can't disconnect the two and just look at the behavior and say, we're just going to ignore all the subjective crap when we know that people that are brought up strong and with emotional regulation aren't going to act violently. That's why there was no school shootings. In the mid early 20th century in America, everybody brought guns to school and they practiced shooting because everybody had emotional regulation. It wasn't even a thought of. It wasn't something anybody even worried about. It's only when you get people that have developmental problems, they're brought up in families of divorces where they're developmentally damaged and they don't have this ability to regulate their own behavior that you get this shit. So I don't know how you can say they're not related, or I mean, you don't want to.
Not saying they're not related. You're missing my point, right? Like, I don't believe that an internal subjective state can be evil,
So,
right?
like,
Because
there's
evil.
also an element here that you can see in Plato where, like, they don't use the terminology, but it is the same thing where they talk about vice and virtue. So, to Stuart's point, and that is like, okay, you're not doing evil in terms of that definition, but if vice then would be something that um, makes the internal state worse, and then consequently down the line your behavior when it's a slippery slope.
Circular
That
causation there.
that is the point that he's making, which I would agree with because I mean I've seen it, and okay, like when you bring in a lot of the complexity of the developmental and the stages, neurodevelopmental stages, things that we know about dispositions genetically, like we were talking about, it makes things more muddy and more difficult. But I would agree with the sentiment that, like, if from the get go, I mean, even when you're born in a good family, but that there's a propagation of virtue and a propagation of this, like, okay, we're seeking coherence and harmony, to put it in other terms, and that you don't do any, anything that brings you away from homeostasis or entropy, to use that word from neuroscience, then you're doing good, and that good will flow out of you, to put it more
Mhm.
poetically, and then continue to do so because it's a practice thing in that sense as well.
Yeah, and I think that you are talking about essentially the Kant's hypothetical imperative. Like, if that's your goal to do good, and this is where we get into a whole bunch of other issues, the aesthetic preference thing, right? Like, there's things that are not in the field of ethics that are in the field of, you can think about in good and like virtue and vice. That's a good way to think about it. That destroys or somehow downregulates your ability to be the best version of yourself, right? And I think there's a lot of ways you can do that. Substances are one way, right? Like, you can, like, you can smoke weed, and it's like you should be able to. There's no ethical component, in my view, to somebody smoking weed. That's a personal choice. You own yourself. You can eat a bunch of fast food and get fat. There's a ways you can harm yourself that I don't think rise to the level of evil, but it would be in the state there, or so the category of aesthetically preferable. Like, if you want to be a healthy human being, you shouldn't eat all the bullshit. You should have a whole foods diet. You should exercise, right? Like, that's what I'm talking about. And it gets very muddy. And this is where I think that it's very hard to
Well,
talk about these things.
it gets muddy because of the scales that I mentioned to begin with. I mean, like if I drink Like, cause I have a problem, like, developmental problems, like, I'm angry all the time, so I drink, okay? What happens when I drink? I beat my wife, okay? Where can you trace the cause of that beating of the wife? If you're just saying evil begins as soon as I start beating my wife, then you're completely neglecting the causal variables that led to me beating my wife. Therefore, you can't address them, understand them, predict them, anything, because you have to understand the causal chain that happening at the scale, not just the scale of the individual, but the scale of development, the scale of the child developing into the adult that had the emotional inventory that caused him to drink, that caused him to beat the wife. So you have to look, you have to backtrack, and you have to understand these things at different scales. And then you have to be able to understand the gestalt, all of them together. Okay. So that's, you kind of have to sort of reverse engineer all of this and then sort of put them back together and say, okay, I got this thing. But it's a thing that isn't just this simple thing like you're saying, if you do that, that's bad. If you do that, that's good. It's far more complicated than that. And if nobody knows that, everybody is just sort of doing what you're saying, Brent, just sort of following 10 commandments or following some sort of, binary ethical protocols. Those sort of things are going to get lost across generations. People are not going to understand why they're doing them anymore. You have to have these fundamental things have to be understood, and they have to be passed down generationally as far as why this is bad, why this is good. We have to have this sort of thing formalized because we're seeing now people don't know. They don't understand what good and evil is. They don't understand why it's good and evil or why it's bad or anything. That's the weirdest thing to me is you talk to people and you just scratch the surface a little bit. They have no idea why things are good or bad. They never even thought about it before.
Yeah, dude, I agree with you, right? So I want to make sure that we understand we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So I want to get really down to brass tacks about purpose, right? The point of ethics is just identification. It is a matter of like judging a behavior. Is this particular action permitted or not permitted? That's all. It's a binary. That's all it is. And so, from a categorical, or sorry, a hypothetical imperative perspective, it's very smart, and I completely agree with you. As a culture, we should be saying, okay, we should not act unethically, right? And if we don't want to act unethically, let's establish a sort of practice to do healthy behaviors, mentally, physically healthy behaviors, so that we can achieve the goal of acting ethically, right? So I think it's all of this together. They're not separate. They're not like contradictory things, but they have separate domains. And I think you're conflating the domains.
Hey, Sim, are you getting a lot of volume reverb off of Brent's audio?
I'm getting some from both of you, but that's because my laptop speakers are this
Oh,
way.
okay.
It should cancel out in the recording. It has like the echo can, so hopefully that won't come
Eh,
through. But I'm hearing it too.
okay. Well, I would just like to sort of round this up by saying that, um, as a practical matter, as far as what to do about evil in the world right now, I always tell people that, just
Pretty nice.
Welcome back, Stuart.
I don't know what happened. My freaking phone just went weird. I don't know what it did.
Well, that's cool, man. As you were saying, I'll just edit that shit out.
Um, where was I? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
It was sort of talking about the social enforcement around things. You were
Oh,
basically
that's
saying,
practical. Yeah. Um, the as a practical matter, I think being able to identify blatantly evil behaviors is something that every individual is responsible for in their little immediate social area, right? And everybody should be made aware that it is, it's evil to harm women, to hurt women, to grab women, to punch women. I mean, that's kind of or children. People that are weak and innocent. If you're in a social situation, if you see that happening, you have a responsibility to stop it, and you have a responsibility to be as a man. I'm not talking about women. I'm talking about as a man. You have a responsibility to sort of enforce just basic social protocols wherever you are. And and that used to be just common knowledge for people, in my grandfather's generation. I was taught that by my grandfather, and his father taught him that wherever you are, you have a responsibility to enforce these sort of basic general things so evil doesn't encroach. And we get to these companies, you work in these companies and there's things that are sort of on the verge of evil and you sort of let it slide. And that's how we get where we are because evil just encroaches. It takes a little bit and it stops. Watches your reaction. Then gets a little closer to you and it stops.
Yep.
And eventually it's right in your freaking face. And, you're like, how did we get here? And I just think that that is something that is necessary to return to is this understanding that it's every man's responsibility to enforce these basic constraints that prevent evil from encroaching. And, I love the Patrick Stewart quote, from Star Trek The Next Generation. A line must be drawn here, this far, no farther. And we all need to get back to that. And it used to be just normal. It doesn't matter if the government says it's okay to genitally mutilate children. It's not. It doesn't matter what you say. These are just standards of behavior that we do not accept. And if we all behave that way, the force of that would cause them to change their behavior. Because if we all agree what evil is and we're not going to tolerate it, that's what the elite shitheads, that's the only thing they listen to is if everybody is like, no, like is one voice. And, I think we really need to get back to that.
Yeah, and I kind of agree, right? Like obviously the standard case of you see somebody, raping a woman in the street, yeah, definitely intervene. And maybe if it's not you, it's some sort of police force or whatever. Somebody should intervene. I got that. And also there's a second component which is saying the truth as you view it, right? This is a Jordan Peterson thing, right? Tell the truth or at least don't lie. Like you have a responsibility when you see something that is violating your conscience to speak. I think that's an important thing. That's not, I mean, it's speaking up against evil, but it's like it's still outside the realm of ethics to a certain degree. Other than, I mean, obviously, the whole point of ethics is identify evil. So it's like, yeah, I see that. That's really bad. That's an important point. But you,
I've always had a problem with Jordan Peterson in that regard because, the truth as far as, when to tell it and when not to really depends on situation. Like if we're at war, telling the truth is not a virtue. Telling your enemies what you're going to do is not a virtue. And there's a gradient of that. There's like we were talking about guileless people that have no capacity to sort of turn the knobs on their sort of candor and they're too candid or they're not candid enough or whatever. All right, there's a sort of volume knob on that. And it's not just tell the truth everywhere or don't lie. I think that's a kind of naive way to look at things. I think the world is more complex than that. Maybe if you're living in a village with, 100 people, yeah, but if you're living in a modern civilization with 8 billion people, or even in a local situation where you have competing interests, like in business, obviously you have to learn to be able to explore those nuances and subtleties of candor and truth, right? Or
yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah. We can just we're smart enough to know the difference, right? When I say this, I'm talking about speak the truth when your values are being violated. When you see this transgression, to call it out,
right,
to say, like you talked about, like I live in corporate America and I've seen the encroachment. I've seen, oh, we're just going to step this for, and I see people. I talk to people that are of my particular demographic, and particular that are like, hey, I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to put my head down because it's not safe.
right.
And I'm like, that type of cowardice causes you to actually be more unsafe than if you were to speak out. And this is a systemic problem in America is people are not, telling the truth. They're
Well,
not
well, the
speaking out when
problem
they need to.
the problem is that we're not intended to do this as individuals. We're intended to do this as groups of people. Individual people are extraordinarily shy about enforcing their individual. I mean, most people. That's just sort of a human characteristic. Where if you don't feel shy about enforcing your individual view of things, then you probably have mental illness because instinctually we feel more comfortable the more people are behind us. Right? If I got 100 people behind me saying, yeah, I feel very confident in what
Yeah.
I'm doing. But if it's just me saying, yeah, I mean, I sort of, where's everybody kind of feeling that everybody gets, right? So,
That's basically how I live my life, Stuart. Unpopular opinion right here.
well, but the thing is that the thing that you should look for in that is you need to gather a group of people that sort of generally agree with you to give, because it makes you feel sort of like and it emphasizes this feeling you have as being an outsider, of being somebody who does not have a sort of social group that you're connected with, which, you know, like I've told you, like I've said, it leads towards pathology. This sort of isolation, even that feeling of isolation that I'm by myself and I'm a rebel, just that is pathological. Your emotional inventory is not intended to function for a long time, isolated from those thoughts that you have are not intended to just exist inside Brent's head. Those thoughts are intended to be shared and balanced, and precision weighted intersubjectively with other people. And if they just spin inside your own head endlessly, it's a type of self cannibalization. It's like they grow and get better, and you're going to have better ideas. They're just going to eat each other, right? Your thought, that's why probably you do this, is because you got to
Probably,
get
yeah.
these damn thoughts out of your freaking head, man. It's almost like self maintenance. You know, all these thoughts in your head have to be shared, and they have to be challenged, and you have to have somebody like me say, no, Brent. And then you can take that in your head and sort of, you know, fiddle with your model a little bit. And the next time you talk, you'll have a little better model, and I'll have a little better model. That's how the whole thing's supposed to work.
Well, that's the
Right?
whole point of the podcast, man. This is legitimately why I do it.
Exactly.
I'm very. You see me online. I'm very opinionated. I have no problem telling literally everybody if I need to that this is the way I see it, and I think you're all wrong. Like no problem with that. But I also am open to receiving feedback. I ask for feedback, and sometimes I'm inflammatory because I want to get a response. I might be provocative because maybe I'm toying with an idea. Maybe I'm on the border. I'm right on the edge of something, and I'm not exactly sure. And I'll poke some buttons to hear like what's the best response? What's the best counter argument? I think that's a healthy way to be because humans can't think in a vacuum. We all go crazy. We all go fucking Unabomber when we're all completely isolated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, social media can behave as that kind of sort of prosthetic for social precision weighting if you learn how to navigate it right. Like X, you know, there's so many bots. That ecosystem is so
Hmm.
weird. But if you learn how to sort of curate your own experiences, like I can post something about, you know, the free energy principle or, you know, some idea I'm having, and then I get a little feedback. And I know Michael Levin. You know, I know Mark Soms, and I talk to them, and they sort of give me that sort of precision weighting through that medium. But I have to ignore 99% of the noise to sort of get the benefit of that, right? So it's kind of hard to navigate, but it can be used that way, right?
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, I know most of the people that interact with. Like, I know your point. There's this group of weirdos that just start sending you stuff, and you're like, yeah, you're probably bots. But there's people that you regularly interact with. You develop a tribe. We've got, you know, obviously we have a limitation on how many people we can keep track of at a time. But you kind of like, oh, okay, regular people interact with me. I can take your opinion to heart. Everybody else, you know, fuck off. Like I just kind of send it to the circular file.
Right. Well, I mean, the reason that works is because, you know, our the structure of our brain is basically in our social structures, our intersubjective structures. Like, are you married, Sim?
I didn't realize I was muted. No, I'm not married.
Are you still dating that girl, that Norwegian girl you moved to Norway to date?
No, no, that also ended quite some time ago.
Oh, I'm
I'm
so
currently
sorry. Okay.
single, just so you know.
Well, the point I was going to make is, you know, and Brent's married, so he knows this. You know, inside of you, you create a model of your wife.
Generative
You
model,
create
yeah,
a
we'll
sort of
project.
virtual model of her emotional inventory that you interact with, right? Okay. And we do this with all of our social intimacies. I have a model of my boss. I have a model of my friends. Inside of me is a virtual model of them. Now, how good a model that is depends on how well I know them and how much experience I have doing shit with them, right? But social media is the same kind of thing. I have a virtual model of Michael Levin, right, in my mind, who Michael Levin is. I never met the freaking dude, but I've interacted with him for years. We've shared emails. I've talked to him on the phone. You know, I mean, I have a model of him. And so we just sort of take this sort of a capacity for intersubjective intimacy, this modeling we do, and then we move it over to social media. You know, it's the same structure, though. We're just moving it over. And there's a lot of things that happen that aren't good when you do that. Um, but basically, because you never met these people, you never been in the same physical proximity to them, and that's usually how the model is created. And there's a lot of things that happen bioelectrically and sort of animalistically that doesn't happen when you model people online. You just sort of you're inventing that part. Like I imagine what Michael Levin is like to be around, like his energy and everything. And invariably, if you think that, like if you were in the same room with me, you have a very different model when you left the room with me than you did before you entered it. Like if we had all these conversations and the three of us met and had dinner or something, The model of me, Stuart, will be enormously updated when you left that table, right? So that's sort of the interesting thing about navigating social media is you have to realize that you're full of shit when you think you know this person that you've never been in the same room with, and you know that because if you ever are in the same room with them, your model of them is enormously updated, right? That's because your model is bullshit when you're dealing with people on social media, right?
I completely agree. I don't know exactly where to go from here. We're getting a little bit short on time, so maybe it's a good time to wrap, man. We've had a great discussion. I think we understand each other a bit more after this. And Sim, thanks for the input, man. This has been a hell of a conversation. Keep in touch. I want to talk to you more about the health and fitness and nutrition stuff too. That's another passion of mine. So maybe we'll
Thank
have to
you.
do another episode with just you on that.
And Sim, it was really good to meet you. And Brent, thanks again for another great talk.
Yeah, absolutely. But why don't you both tell the audience where they can find you online?
Stuart?
I'm active on X. That's the only social media footprint. At Sims Y Stewart. Uh, yeah, that's my account name.
People
Sim?
can find me on X as well. That's where I spend most of my time online. My handle is Sim, so SIMVANDAELE. It's kind of pronounced as Dala, but it has an E in there that might throw people off. So
Cool. I'll link both of you up in the show notes, man. So everyone go check them out. Thank you both for being on the 100th episode. This is super exciting. I really had a great time, and we will chat later.
awesome. Thank you so
Hi,
much for
brother.
having us on.
Bye.